Hi, this is Stephen Jones. We're going to talk about forecasting. This is part one. Forecasting is not fortune telling. It's just taking a look at data and trying to predict what the next set of data is going to be. And that's kind of difficult sometimes because if there's a lot of variation, or if there's trends, or if there's historical ups and downs, seasonal changes, it's going to make it more difficult for us to do a good job of that. And we don't always use numbers anyway. Sometimes we use qualitative techniques as opposed to data, because some decisions that we're making do not necessarily require numerical data. Qualitative data can also be useful to us. And we'll take a look at what some of those are. However, subjective methods, like, as they say, seat of the pants, your gut feeling or intuition, whatever, that's not always bad. But when you're making business decisions, as I said in an earlier module, you're making business decisions, you tend to want to use data or insight or expert opinion more than just, feels like today. Okay? So, what kinds of forecasting models do we have? Well, there's qualitative models, time series models, and causal models. We've talked already a bit about causal models in terms of regression and multiple regression models out there. It's an attempt to forecast what's coming up. Briefly, we're about to look at qualitative models, and we'll explain those in just a moment. And then there's also time series models, and we will talk about a couple of those in this lecture, and then take a look in the next lecture in part 2 of this series on forecasting. So your qualitative models, Delphi method, jury of executive opinion, Salesforce composite, and consumer market surveys. These are ways that have been created to be able to take into account opinions as opposed to specific sales or weight of goods or something like that, to take opinions, which also are important. And so you'll see the Council of Economic Advisors for the president or for a governor might say, hey, this is where we think the economy is going to go. And so the executive would listen to what those opinions would have to say and be able to make some decisions from that. Well, jury of executive opinion, that is really what that Council of Economic Advisors, or if you remember, if you've ever seen the movie The Godfather, and he has those advisors that come around and tell him things and help him to understand, or a presidential cabinet, okay? That's a jury of executive opinion right there. And they are people who have some level of expert knowledge and can give some insight. And we're not talking necessarily quantitative data. In fact, that's really not what their value is right at that point. They have looked at the data, and they have insight as to what they think that data means. A Delphi method is a specific method of gathering opinions in, discussing them, editing them, and sending it back out and getting new opinions in or revised opinions in, and doing this through several rounds. Salesforce composites, you're going to get this from people who are out there on the front lines and what trends they see, either in what consumers are buying or what industries asking for. And consumer market surveys, we really take a look at them and say, hey, your consumer satisfaction, do they feel good about the marketplace? Do they feel like they're going to buy a new house or a new car? Or do they think they're going to spend as much this Christmas as they did last Christmas? And those kinds of market surveys, they're all valuable, but they're qualitative data. And useful as qualitative data. If we look at more quantitative data out there, one way to look at this is through a time series model. And that means we're going to look at historical data and try to predict or forecast the future. Not predict like, ooh, you're going to get married someday, but rather try to forecast what we think next month's sales are going to be, or next year's expenses are going to be. And we're doing this based on information that we've had from historical data. Now, a pure time series method uses just one variable at a time, as opposed to and one observation at a time, as opposed to the weighted averages that we'll look at in just a moment. But there are different kinds of time series. The trend, seasonal, cyclical, and random series, they can be combined to tell a little more complex kind of a story out there. So a trend would be something like this line here, which is going up, like this line right there, and that shows a trend that's up or a trend that's down. The variations up and down are what we'll see when we see something cyclical or seasonal out there. Sales of gasoline, or say, go up at summer, down in the fall, up over the holidays, down the first part of the year, back up, down and down and down. And you see that kind of variation, some kind of a cycle or seasonal variation to it. And then random variation stuff, just up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, down, up, down, 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 up, 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 down, down. That's all random out there. And so you have a series of those things that happen, and you try to make the best decisions that you can about what's going on. And sometimes it's pretty difficult. Sometimes it's pretty difficult to figure out that this one thing is happening or that one thing is happening. So how do we determine whether or not our forecast was good? Well, you can just say, well, I was off by three last month, or how spot on are you? Or you can have a statistical measure of it, and one of those statistical measures is the MAD, mean absolute deviation. And that just means that whether you aimed high or low, you were a little off. So you look at the absolute value of the deviation rather than whether it was off a -3 or off a +3. It's off 3 from the actual observation, and it doesn't matter if it's got a plus or a minus sign. You add all of those up and divide by the number of observations, and you get the average or mean absolute deviation, and that's what the MAD is. And it gives you some idea of how close you were overall, how close your model was. And so let me go back. And so in a situation where we're trying to forecast in a completely naive fashion here, we're trying to forecast what next month is going to be and saying that it will match last month's sales. So I look at what last month was, and I will say that's what this month's sales are going to be. And that may actually be the case. That straight forecast like that, here was last month, here's what I am this month, that may tell the story in some situations. Often it's not that way, but there may be situations where that's exactly it. So you'll notice that what sales were last month was 110, and the next month is what we forecasted to be, and then it really came out to be 100. So we forecast the next month to be 100, and it was 120, and then we forecast 120, and it was 140, and 140, 170, 170, 150, 150, 160, blah, blah, blah. See all of that. And so that kind of a naive model out there is not necessarily going to keep us up to date, But what it does do is it does give us some means for trying to say, well, here's where I think the month is going. I had this really very similar kind of model used when I was running a truck stop 100 billion years ago. But we had tobacco sales. We would sell cartons and packs of cigarettes, and every week we counted the number of packs of each brand and size and box of cigarettes. And as I said, this was a long time ago. We would count each one of those, and then we had a sheet of paper that said, okay, here's the average number that we have right now that we've been selling, and this is how much I have on hand, so this is how many I need to order for the next couple of weeks worth of sales. And if I noticed that there was a trend happening, then I could adjust my forecast. But if I noticed that I was staying within lines, then this is exactly what I would do. So very similar here. Counts based on what I did before and what I think is going to happen in the future, based on simple counts. There was no alterations and no weighting or anything along those lines. It was just simple. Count what I got, look at what I did last week. That's what I think is going to happen next week. Okay, so if you do the mean absolute deviation there, so we're going to actually take a look at how close I was, then I could guess if my model is a little off and if I need to adjust that model or not. And what it shows here is that my average, my mean deviation or variation from reality was just under 18, whatever that is. The sales of wireless speakers, so I was off 18 each week, and that means I was off about 20%. It would look like, because about 18, well, somewhere between 10 and 20%. But that may not be bad. That may be close enough as long as your inventory levels are up. That's, you just have to look and see what it is that you are actually trying to count and forecast out there as to what could actually be useful. And we've talked about the mean squared error, absolute percent error, and the concept of bias before if you've gone through your statistics classes. And these are other measures of how close you are with your forecast. Now, if you're looking at random variations that are going up and down, may not have historical value, then we can use such things as moving averages, weighted moving averages, and exponential smoothing. And moving average is basically just an average of the last few periods, how many ever periods you choose to look at, and use that to find a mean, and then use that as your guess for what the next sales are going to be, or the next consumption, or next set of expenses, or whatever that might be. And so you take a look, and this is what a mathematical formula to do that really does. Each observation is the last X number, or in this case, N number of observations that you're looking for. So if you want to look at the last 6 months or last 6 weeks or last 3 weeks of observations and forecast out, you can do that. So in this example, they have collected data for the last year, and they use a 3-month moving average. And that 3-month moving average, and equaling 3, you will forecast what happens on the 4th month based on what months 1, 2, and 3 have, and that's what we look at right here. So January, February, and March are averaged together, and that is the prediction for what April will do. And you have in the left column what the actual sales were and the 3-month moving average put those together, you add each one together, you divide it by 3, and you come up with, here's what I think it's going to be. And 11.67 was my forecast, and then I had 16, 13.67, 19, 16, 23, etc. Now, if it's relatively, if there's not really a trend, as in a growth or a decline or something cyclical going on, if that's not the case, if there's just random variations up and down, then this kind of a moving average is probably pretty good. Because if it's just randomly going up and down, you kind of smooth this thing through by adding these 3 together. Whereas your naive method before, you would have forecast 10 for February instead of 12, 12 for March instead of 13, 13 for April instead of 16. And you'll notice you could be closer or farther off. If you just say, well, last month I did this, so that's what I'll do this month. It kind of tries to guess based on several things. Now, if you do have a historical move up, trend up or down, you're going to find that this trails because you are not, your next one's going to be, if it's going up, your next one's going to be higher than your last 3 because you're going up. And if it's coming down, your next one's going to be lower than the last 3 because you're going down. And so you will always undercut whatever it is that you're doing in a 3-month moving average. A weighted moving average uses the same concept, but the difference is that we're going to weight the most recent data higher than data from before. And we're going to see a similar concept when we're looking at doing PERT and CPM work in the last module. Not exactly the same, but the concept of weighting is out there. But in this situation, we're going to look at the most recent data and give it more weight than data from a ways back. And so we do that same calculation, and now we are hoping that our new calculation's a little bit better. We have 3 times this, 2 times this, and 1 times this, so that most recent data has higher weight than more distant data. And in doing so, hopefully we have a better number as a forecast than we would have had otherwise. Thank you.